Today we're going to be recapping the World Championships 2024. There was plenty of surprises and controversy at this tournament, so we're going to be going through all of it today, as well as the actual top 8 deck list and some other standout interesting lists, as well as the day 1 and 2 conversion. So going into the World Championships, it definitely seemed like the sort of top contenders, the best performing decks in the online spaces as well as in Japan, was going to be the Reggie Drago Vstar, gaining a ton of support from the set, and that definitely panned out, as we'll look at not only the top 8 but also the day 1 and 2 conversion. But also Gardevoir was doing very well in the online spaces. Charizard was notably doing like really badly, although it had a lot of hype from the early Japanese gym battle data as well. So there's a big question mark around Charizard. And then there was also this narrative forming of how do we counter the Reggie Drago archetype, and oftentimes people came to the conclusion of the likes of Lugia and some of these aggressive style, basic attacking 2-prize archetypes like Maridon, like Roaring Moon, which we'll get onto in a moment as well, because obviously I had a great tournament. Let's start with the day 1 analysis then. And my hot take for this tournament, by the way, I did the Worlds pre-show, and I said that Iron Thorns EX was going to get at least 1 win in one of the age divisions. So bear that in mind as we go through this, because Iron Thorns was a popular deck, so popular that it made day 1 graphic of the play percentage, 5.5%. 63 players chose to play the Iron Thorns EX archetype. But I think almost a bigger story is that the Reggie Drago made it all the way up to 24%. We haven't seen that high of a meta share for a decent amount of time, actually. At the very peak of Charizard's powers, maybe, we saw percentages like that, but definitely a lot of the top players said that this is the deck to bring. This has the most versatile matchup spread where you can make these tech inclusions for other decks whilst having, you know, a great way to demonstrate lots of different attacking outputs. So you have lots of different game plans into different archetypes. So it wasn't surprising it was the most popular deck, but I think it was slightly surprising to see as high as 24%. The second and third, both at sort of 12.8 and 12.6%, was Charizard and Lugia Archeops. You would expect that Lugia, mostly a counterpick to Reggie Drago, but also like decent in its own right, you know, has that power level behind it with the Primal Turbo, of course. And Charizard, still people found ways to feel like they're confident enough into the Reggie Drago deck, I suppose. I think that was one of the big debates, whether you do still go down the Dusknoir line, whether you look to have other tech inclusions for the controlling matchups, whether you want to play Cancelling Cologne, which I think was a really good choice for the tournament, not only because it helps against some of the walling Pokemon, but also against Iron Thorns, which popped up. And yeah, I think we'll look at some really interesting Charizard builds, because the most successful ones were making some pretty interesting decisions. Then Gardevoir, a bit less popular than I expected, actually. I would have expected this to be in the top 3 decks of popularity, but sub 10% and 9.6 there. Still a decent amount of representation, but this was doing some of the best. This had some of the best results in the online spaces, so I expected it to be a little bit more popular than it actually was. Possibly there are things to consider at the World Championships, like time constraints and whatnot, when ties are so awkward. And also it doesn't have the best Reggie Drago matchup, so maybe that just put a number of players off from the get-go. So in hindsight, maybe it's a little bit more realistic. And then Raging Bolt still very, very popular, actually. That 9.3% is the most played, like, aggressive 2-prize strategy out there. There were murmurings of Maridon that did well in some of the online events, and there was some Roaring Moon, although I think that was probably the least respected among the sort of 3 racing style archetypes, which is interesting, and we'll get onto that when we look at the deck list as well. But Raging Bolt was by far the sort of most popular pick among the aggro players out there. And then moving on to day 2, it was just a bit of a reshuffle of those same top 6 decks in terms of popularity, making it through to the second day of competition. Reggie Drago, despite being 24% day 1, actually improved on its percentage in that second day, which is very rare to see for the most popular deck in the room when you think about how many mirror matches they have to face and whatnot. So Reggie Drago really was wiping the floor with a lot of other decks in the room, which is surprising. Lugia did okay. Charizard kind of did averaging. Guardy was kind of the worst off the bunch, where it dropped down a couple slots, and we see Raging Bolt and Iron Thorns pick up in their percentages as well. Also, just quickly hopping over to PTCG Legends to look at the conversion of these archetypes, you can see that Iron Thorns did very, very well. Chien-Pao did exceptionally well, but bear in mind it had such a low play rate that it's really only very dedicated players playing Chien-Pao that got very far. Lost Box did absolutely terribly. Gardevoir did very poorly as well. Raging Bolt doing pretty reasonably. And Reggie Drago, for that high of a play rate to still have that high of a conversion, is really, really promising. So yeah, really interesting to have a look at these statistics thanks to PTCG Legends. They've updated their website very recently with just even more statistics and data that you can delve into. So definitely a website that you should check out. I'm just going through Limitless because they have great displays of the lists, but I do think this is another great website to check out for lots of different data points and whatnot, and especially conversion graphics, I think, is something that we don't see a lot of. We just have the sort of day 1 to day 2, and then we make our own predictions. But actually seeing the actual percentage, the raw percentages here, is a better representation of like what was the deck for the tournament, I suppose. And I think by the looks of things, Iron Thorns was the deck for the tournament, just by the droves doing very well with it from day 1 to day 2. And of course, we'll have a look at the top cut now. So Fernando Cifuentes was able to win the World Championships with Iron Thorns EX. I'm pretty happy to see this, to be honest with you, because it was my prediction, and I know a lot of my teammates ended up playing this archetype, so it's cool to see that it had the legs to go the distance, despite being a very basic deck at its core. The initialization ability just shutting down all rulebox abilities, so you're really hindering a lot of draw engines from even the very aggressive archetypes using Radiant Greninja, Squawkabilly, Ogerpon. Those are all sort of not usable. And then for the evolving decks, they don't get Rotom Draw, they don't get Luminion. Same thing for like Lugia, of course, and Lugia can't use its own Summoning Star. So there's so many things you cover, and obviously Charizard, requires its own energy acceleration a lot of the time. People are going down to as low as like 5 fire energy in the list. So with the Crushing Hammers, with the Giovanni's Charisma, and this ability, you can really deny a lot of attacks just outright and buy yourself a lot of turns just from having that ability alone. And the Volt Cyclone, it's 140 base damage. You can offset the double turbo energy with the Future Booster Energy Capsule, so you're two-shotting the V-Stars, you're two-shotting, basic EXs. It may take a little longer to get through the EX Pokemon, but what we're trying to do here, as you can see with this list, 3 copies of Boss's Orders and 4 copies of Pokemon Catcher. In addition to the A-spec of Prime Catcher, we really are trying to target evolving Pokemon whenever they're hitting the board, so we can just take out either energy and just chase those sorts of things on Charmanders and Charmeleon, or just make sure we're bringing these things back into the active Pokemon before they've been able to attack with them. So if someone's trying to manually power up a Charizard on the bench, we can bring it to the active, make sure we're punching it immediately before they're able to, get value out of those sorts of cards. So even though we are playing 8 coin flipping effects, the actual outcome of these heads flips are so massive just because of how annoying Iron Thorns can be, and your opponent is left really not drawing as many cards as they would like and don't have access to as many cards as they would usually have. So that combination with these disruptive item cards is absolutely massive in this archetype. You can see there's the 3 copies of Judge in the deck list, as well as that 1 Iono with very early on hand disruption. I think Judge was kind of the big winner of the Worlds, actually, because it was in both the finalist deck lists. And 3 copies is very, very disruptive indeed. The cancelling clones are so that you can get through annoying walling Pokemon for the most part. And of course, paired with the Lost City, you're going to get rid of things like Mimikyu for good. The Chorus's Tenacity is another big card that we see Fernando use a decent amount of times here, so they could cherry pick double turbo energy as well as Lost City, DT being that big thing that lets you Volt Cyclone on turn 2. So having those extra guarantees also makes this deck just much more consistent of what it's trying to achieve, because there are going to be those games where you choose to go first, don't necessarily have access to that turbo energize, and you require turn 2 DTE. Overall, it's a deck list of Iron Thorns that we have seen a decent amount of times, but the 4 copies of Pokemon Catcher was a big statement here from Fernando. I think a number of players wouldn't have been playing those in their list, and it seemed to be a really smart call for the tournament. So huge congratulations to Fernando. It seemed like karma was on your side with the way the top 8 panned out, but take nothing away from this victory. So Sinosuke brought Roaring Moon to the table and got all the way to the finals with this archetype. And was this actually the best aggro smashing archetype all along? Jesse Parker had an insane run with Maridon, which we'll have a look at in a minute, and Raging Bolt did still make top 8, so all of the aggressive decks seem to do pretty well. But I think some of the big boasts of Roaring Moon is that you get to play 2 copies of Judge in the list because you're a little bit less tied to Sada than something like a Raging Bolt would be, because you also have the backup of Dark Patch within your list, and you naturally counter control so much better than the likes of Raging Bolt and even Maridon, really, because you have that Petulant EX, you have a single prize attacker in Roaring Moon, and you even have Frenzied Gouging that you can use against them as well, and you have double Judge Power Pad, so you really should be getting through most of the controlling matchups. And let's face it, Mist Energy is only in Lugia. For everything else, you're going to be racing very, very effectively here. You can see just how streamlined Sinosuke made this deck list, and I think it's a real great strength of the list, really, having played it a decent amount now over the last couple of days. Having this high of an item ratio with those quad Pokestops so you don't whiff on your Calamity Storm damage just makes so much sense here. And the 4 Pokemon Catcher, yes, you're flipping coins, but we've seen it in the past be very, very powerful in the Roaring Moon archetype, just making sure you're cherry picking what you're KOing with so many more bench 2 prize Pokemon with of Pheasantipity coming into the format with the amount of V-Stars in the metagame right now. Making sure that you're just chaining those Sardas and still guaranteeing those 2 prize knockouts is absolutely insane for the deck. Also, of course, a big boast comparing this deck to a Raging Bolt is that Pecharunt, in a number of matchups, may require Gusting to finish out the game, but Pecharunt in the very late game getting to that 240 or sometimes in the best case scenario 300 damage allows it to be like a really broken Ursaluna almost, where you have Dark Patch and Turn Attachment and you can get into the mix very, very aggressively with this card. So it's actually a great late game swing option, and I think a number of players were expecting this card to be more impactful in the finals than it actually was, but definitely when you playtest this archetype, you'll find that Pecharunt is often part of your plan in the late game stages to take those final couple prizes. And of course, who could forget Pheasantipity EX in this deck list? I think it's no surprise that we saw Roaring Moon, Raging Bolt, and Maridon all profiting in this format from Fez coming into the deck list, because it allows these aggressive archetypes to just keep churning through those prizes, have enough fuel, find those final combination pieces to get over the line. Whereas in previous formats, the Ionos and the Unfair Stamps were just too detrimental, and you could be left with nothing and kind of go all in too early. Now these decks have that bit more stopping power to continue their pressure and just outrace opponents much more effectively. It definitely seems like with the popularity of Reggie Drago in day one, these were a brilliant meta call for the tournament. Next up, let's talk about the Maridon King, Jesse Parker. I think a lot of people were rooting for Jesse because he had such an amazing season with Maridon being his sort of pet archetype, getting 1 top 8 and 1 top 4 with the deck earlier on in the season, then riding this deck all the way to the World Championships when it certainly was a more sort of off-the-wall pick. And of course, Jesse was undefeated in the Swiss rounds, undefeated all the way until that top 4 matchup up against Fernando, where, as we saw, there was 3 electric generators prized in game 3, and it's not like it was a done deal if he had access to those generators, but his entire usual game plan kind of goes out the window from that aspect. So the fact that Jesse still put up a really good fight in that end game was great to see, and it just didn't work out for him this time around, but still had a phenomenal run with Maridon. We know that Jesse's played this deck to death, so probably has a perfect list by the looks of things. Doesn't seem like there's much dead weight at all, and we see 2 copies of Squawkabilly, 2 copies of Forest Hill Stone, just to say that you're going to be in games no matter what. Rather than playing the Academy at Night Stadium, still sticking with that 1 copy of Town Store in the list just to supplement that tool package, and going very light on those overall supporter cards, but having the Mew EX as well as the new Pheasantipity in the list, as well as the every now and then fleet-footed draw, and of course Greninja, sort of allowing you to play an even higher count of energy cards in your deck list to just make sure the electric generators are rocking and rolling throughout the entire game. Jesse had an insane run and kept Maridon on the map. This is a deck to keep in mind for the future as well, where I think it's going to be improving going into the next sets. Next up, we have a whole heap of Reggie Drago decks to go through. Here we have Raz in top 4, choosing to play no copies of Horlucha or Radiant Charizard. Those were very popular picks for the majority of players in the online spaces. Instead, incorporating the Cleffa in the deck list to have that free retreat pivot option, to have the Grasping draw play just to stay in the game. Raz also chose to play no copies of Pheasantipity EX, which is a real surprise to me because I thought that card was absolutely insane. Instead, having like that 4th copy of Ogerpon in the deck by the looks of things, and also having a split of energy that also supplements the Ogerpon that little bit more with the 8-2 split rather than the very common 7-3. Next up, we have Isaiah Bradner's list, and this was also piloted by Grant Shen to top 16, so great pedigree behind this one, where we have that thin package of dragons, and it is incorporating the sort of more expected cards of Pheasantipity, Radiant Charizard, and Horlucha, and we see a 7-3 split of energy in this case, but has 2 copies of Super Rod to sort of supplement that approach. Very interesting that Isaiah was choosing to play 0 copies of Superior Energy Retrieval and just went down the Super Rod route instead, favouring fitting in a 2nd copy of Stadium, which you don't really see in the deck all too often, and that comes in the form of Pokestop, which just allows you to have extra discard synergy and a bit more dig in the deck, just for the big hits of Energy Switch and those Ball Search cards as well. Next up, we come on to Ian's list, and again, just small tweaks here and there. This time, Ian was choosing to play the Hisuian Goodra, which, as we know, is good against the Iron Thorns matchup. We also saw the Superior Energy Retrieval in the list, as well as 1 Rod and 1 Night Stretcher. I do like the flexibility between the 3 here. I think it's a great thing to do. I was trying to squeeze in an extra space out of my list to have just still that 2 Superior, but I definitely like having the Rod and the Night Stretcher just to give yourself less headache with your Legacy Stars throughout the game. So yeah, really solid list from Ian overall. Definitely one of my favourites. Oh, and our previous world champion Vance Kelly also played the exact same 60s, so you know it's going to be a good one. And finally, we have Michael Davidson's top 8 list. This was also played by Caleb Rogerson and Andrew Hedrick, so again, great pedigree behind the players there, and choosing to drop the Radiant Charizard in this instance, keeping with the Hisuian Goodra though, making space for a couple extra supporter cards actually, with a 3rd copy of Boss and the 1 Professor Cherry in the deck list, and again, weaving back towards that sort of 2 count of Super Rod to again safeguard you around those research Searches and Painful Legacy Stars. So rounding out our top 8 then, it was the Raging Bolt archetype by James Goering, with the Ogerpon, of course, a pretty streamlined Pokemon count, the supporter lineup that you would expect. Actually, it's overall just a very simplistic list that we've seen time and time again from Raging Bolt. Again, sticking to those very high item ratios with your couple copies of Pokestop. I think the standout card here is Bravery Charm coming into the deck list. The Bravery Charms are actually really good into the Reggie Drago matchup because of how often they're trying to weave in 4 prize turns with an attack with their Dragapult EX and then trying to make Gust plays happen. So I think having that denial option available, especially with the 2 switch cards as well, would have made a big difference in those matchups. Of course, this Worlds was an asymmetrical top cut, and Rahul already got 9th place with Lugia, the highest placing list, and a really interesting deck list at that, where it's very basic focused, with a Raikou V in the list, as well as Weirdeer V, Iron Hands as the 1 count, and Blood Moon Ursaluna in the deck list, and just having a 1/1 count of Chinchino in the deck to be a prize offset option. Because you're playing the Weirdeer, you kind of have to play the 4 copies of Double Turbo as part of your 16 energy count, but as you can see, there's 1 basic Lightning in the deck, as well as 1 Earthen Vessel. I think that's definitely important into things like the Gardevoir matchup, which I imagine Rahul was expecting here, where people are just hoping that they can cross their fingers, use their E-Hammer on the Legacy, and that shuts off Iron Hands for the remainder of the game. If now you can get a turn attachment of basic Lightning and a Boss's Orders in the list, there are 4 copies in this one, you can cash in on that Iron Hands once again, and it can just be game over from that point. I also really like the choice of Iron Bundle. It does support a heavy hands approach, which this list is. Even with just 1 copy, you're leaning into it that little bit more with the basic Lightning, and it can even come up against things like the Reggie Drago matchup, where you can get your Lugia Vstar attacking into their bench Pokemon rather than hitting into a Reggie Drago itself, especially if they've used a Goodra attack. So ultimately, a very, very cheeky hybrid. I have to hear from him as to why there's a Raikou V in the deck list, because I think that's the space that stands out the most to me here. Also, of course, choosing to play Squawkabilly rather than Carmine in the deck, even with 2 copies of Luminion in the list. I suppose that's more of a leaning towards the Nespal package that he's gone with here. Yeah, really, really interesting counts overall, but huge props to Rahul for making it this far with Lugia, which seemed to be well placed, but again, didn't have a fantastic tournament overall. The highest placing Charizard was in 10th place, and it was good old Tord Reklev with an absolute mash of Pokemon. Just a 2-1-2 Charizard line to fit in the 2-1-2 Pidgeot, where we have the TM Evolution in the deck list, as well as a 1-1 line of Bibarel, a 1-1 line of Rabska, rather than having a Manaphy in the deck list. Of course, the upside of Rabska is that with the Spherical Shield, rather than Manaphy just protecting bench damage, you now prevent all damage and effects of attacks, so now you're protecting yourself against Dragapult. I think a clear vision being that when you're going second into the Reggie Drago matchup, you're going to attempt to TM Evo into the likes of Pidgeot plus Rabska, or, Bibarel plus Rabska as your turn 1 going second play, and from there really make their attacking threats far less dangerous. Because with that 1 board space covered, you're protecting yourself against a Kieran play, as well as that damage counter placement. Tord also chose to go away from Rotom in the deck list, possibly again because you're weaving into TM Evo instead, that you will be ending your turn a little bit less on that instant charge, I suppose, in theory, but it does still have the Poffinable option of Cleffa in the list. Interestingly, has the Squovert option in the deck as well, which again sort of leans into the fact that there will be those board states where you're trying to go all single prize, and Bibarel Squovert is still a very robust engine. And Tord sticking with the sort of best 5 cards that he identified at the NAIC, the Radzard, the Double Count Catcher, the Temple of Sinnoh, and the Unfair Stamp still make his list today with Charizard. A Chinese player made top 16 with Gardevoir, Luo Tiang Qing. I hope I'm pronouncing that at least a little bit closely. I apologize if not. They're actually rocking a pretty straightforward Gardevoir, which is surprising when this isn't their sort of primary format right now. It does still have the Cresselia, which was being dropped by a number of pilots, and it made space for the 1 copy of Night Stretcher. But outside of that, it's just straightforward, bog standard Gardevoir, and they went very far with it. Congrats to them. Lucas Zing also got top 16 with his trusty Chen Pal. The deck has changed a little bit to keep up with the metagame. As you can see, there's an interesting supporter lineup here where we are incorporating 1 Iono as well as 1 Silene in the list. And of course, there is a 1-1 Palkia Vstar in the deck now. This was very popular over in Japan, and I think it might be a nice safeguard to the likes of a turn 2 Dragapult attack from a Reggie Drago player to still give you some fuel to Hailblade with. You have to assume this is the optimal list because Lucas has played much more Chen Pal than anyone else on the planet right now. Also a shout out to Alessandro Cremascoli, who once again found a way to play Pidgeot control in the tournament and got top 32 here. Some of the newer includes in the deck is going to be the Genesect that can turn off Ace Specs, and I imagine the Cornerstone Ogerpon EX was was in much more of the spotlight here, just being such a powerful card in format right now. Alessandro tested a bunch online on his YouTube channel, so you could basically know his deck list if you cared to look, and I still think it's incredible that top competitors like this, especially for an archetype like Control, which is so specific to its counts in terms of what to play around, that he's so open about his testing and is basically giving free coaching to anyone who wants to watch. It was also fun to see some Goldengo scattered around the top 64 as well. I've actually been laddering a bunch of Goldengo. This is my favorite PTCGL deck because it's just fast and is a nice sequencing deck. Of course, gains the new Pheasantipity EX, which is amazing for this archetype, which is trying to piece together combos toward the latter stages. I was very surprised to see the Hyper Aroma inclusion as well as Pokemon catchers, rather than just going down the guaranteed Prime Catcher route. But when you get 3 or 4 Goldengo online from turn 2, you really are popping off, so you can't really argue with just drawing a bunch of cards. The deck gained Night Stretcher, which is really, really nice for a 60 that plays so many one-of Pokemon and naturally has synergy with Pokestop, so you can actually hit your Goldengo knowing that you can then Irida for Night Stretcher on the next turn. And as you can see, there are no Ultra Ball in this list whatsoever. It's just a difficult card to play when you're already committing your discard synergies to the superior energy retrievals, so I think there's definitely something there with a Night Stretcher plus Pokestop combo, even if you don't play the Hyper Aroma build. Personally, in my testing online, I've been going 2 Night Stretcher and 3 Pokestop. I think the ratios for this list really do lean into that stop a little bit more, but this is a slightly heavier supporter-based build with the 3 Cypher, the 3 Irida, as well as those 2 copies of Boss and Roxanne, so you can see why they've done the ratios the way they have. So one last congratulations to everyone just for making the World Championships as well as going far in the tournament. It was a really fun one to watch. I was a spectator for the first time. I've been at World since 2016, but this was the first time I wasn't casting or playing, unfortunately, so I'm really chomping at the bit to get back into the action and start practicing for the next format. Me and Jack have already built some decks in paper, and we are starting to practice the new set as well. Of course, I'm still going to revisit this format because there is a major still in this format, but our attention is going to start diverting towards the new set as well, so look forward to that. Might be some tabletop testing, might be some other forms of testing. We haven't quite figured it all out yet, but just know that we are going to be right on the pulse for the new set. Hope you enjoyed today's video, and I'll see you tomorrow for another one. Cheers.